The bulldozers were already tearing through Marcus's prized Japanese garden when Karen Sterling appeared at his fence line, her manicured nails gripping the chain link like talons. "You missed a spot," she called out, pointing at the koi pond he'd spent 15 years perfecting. "My kids can't see the mountains anymore." What Karen didn't know was that Marcus had just received a phone call that would change everything, and her precious view was about to become the least of her problems. Some neighbors push too far. Some secrets run too deep. And some acts of revenge are absolutely perfect. Marcus Chen had always believed that good fences made good neighbors. Standing in his backyard at dawn, watching the morning light dance across the surface of his meticulously maintained koi pond, he reflected on the 15 years he'd spent transforming this quarter-acre into his own slice of paradise. The Japanese maples were finally mature enough to provide the dappled shade he'd envisioned, their crimson leaves creating a canopy over the stone pathways he'd laid by hand. Every rock had been placed with intention, every plant chosen for its contribution to the harmony of the whole. The tranquility shattered at exactly 7:43 a.m. "Marcus! Marcus!" He turned toward the voice, knowing already who it belonged to. Karen Sterling stood at the fence line that separated their properties, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her yoga outfit pristine and obviously expensive. In the 3 years since she and her husband Brad had moved into the McMansion next door, Karen had made it her mission to reshape the entire neighborhood according to her vision of suburban perfection. "Good morning, Karen," Marcus said, setting down the fish food he'd been scattering across the pond surface. His koi, conditioned by routine, continued their lazy circles, unperturbed by the interruption. "Don't you good morning me, Karen," snapped, her voice carrying the sharp edge it always took on when she was building toward a demand. "Do you see what you've done?" Marcus followed her pointing finger toward the back corner of his yard, where a cluster of mature bamboo created a natural privacy screen. The bamboo had been there when he'd bought the house, but over the years he'd carefully cultivated it, creating a living wall that blocked the view of the industrial park beyond the subdivision. "I see bamboo," Marcus said carefully. "The same bamboo that's been there for, it's grown too tall." Karen's voice rose to the pitch that had become infamous at homeowners association meetings. "Madison and Bryce can't see the mountains from their playroom anymore. That bamboo is blocking their view." Marcus blinked slowly, processing the complaint. The mountains Karen was referring to were barely visible on a clear day, a faint outline on the horizon that required squinting to make out. The bamboo, on the other hand, provided privacy for both their properties and had never been an issue until this moment. "Karen, the bamboo is entirely on my property. It's not violating any HOA regulations, and I don't care about regulations," she interrupted, stepping closer to the fence. "My children have a right to see the mountains. You need to cut it down." "I'm not cutting down my bamboo." The statement hung in the morning air like a challenge. Marcus had learned, through painful experience, that giving Karen an inch inevitably led to her taking several miles. 2 years ago, it had been his vegetable garden. Apparently, the sight of tomato plants lowered her property values. Last year, she'd demanded he remove the wind chimes his late wife had hung from the oak tree because they were too ethnic sounding. Each time, Marcus had tried to be reasonable, to compromise. He'd moved the garden to a less visible location, taken down the wind chimes. But Karen's demands had only grown bolder, more outrageous. "Then we have a problem," Karen said, her voice dropping to the dangerous whisper she used when issuing ultimatums. "Because I've already spoken to Brad about this, and he agrees that something needs to be done." Marcus almost laughed. Brad Sterling was a soft-spoken accountant who spent most of his time hiding in his home office, emerging only to walk their overindulged golden retriever or to nod along with whatever Karen had decided that day. The idea that Brad had strong opinions about bamboo was laughable. "What exactly are you suggesting, Karen?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you." She paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. "Cut down the bamboo, or I'll make your life miserable. And trust me, Marcus, I'm very good at making people miserable." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Karen's smile was razor-sharp. "You have until Friday." She turned and walked away, her designer sneakers making no sound on the perfectly Manicured lawn. Marcus watched her go, feeling the familiar knot of frustration tightening in his chest. Karen had a talent for finding pressure points, for identifying exactly what mattered most to people and then threatening it. But this time was different. This time, she'd gone too far. Marcus walked slowly back toward his house, his mind already working. The bamboo wasn't just landscaping, it was a living memorial to his wife, Sarah. She'd loved the way it whispered in the wind, the privacy it provided, the sense of being enclosed in their own secret garden. After her death 5 years ago, tending to the bamboo had become one of the ways Marcus kept her memory alive. Karen knew this. She'd attended Sarah's funeral, had heard Marcus speak about how much Sarah had loved their garden. The demand to cut down the bamboo wasn't about her children's view of distant mountains, it was about establishing dominance, about proving that she could force Marcus to sacrifice something precious for her convenience. Inside his house, Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out through the window at his backyard sanctuary. The morning light was hitting the bamboo grove, creating patterns of shadow and light that Sarah had called nature's cathedral. His phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor across the street, elderly Mrs. Patterson, saw Karen stomping around this morning. What did she want now? Marcus typed back, the bamboo. The response came immediately, of course she did. That woman won't be satisfied until she owns the whole neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson wasn't wrong. In the 3 years since Karen had moved in, she'd systematically worked to reshape the entire block according to her vision. The Johnsons had been forced to repaint their house after Karen complained to the HOA about the color. The Martinez family had removed their decorative ironwork after Karen claimed it was lowering property values. Even old Mr. Hendricks had been pressured into replacing his front yard cactus garden with Karen-approved grass. Most of the neighbors had eventually given in to Karen's demands, finding it easier to comply than to fight. But Marcus was different. He'd spent 15 years creating his garden, pouring his grief and his memories into every carefully chosen plant. This wasn't just about bamboo, it was about the line between reasonable neighborly compromise and outright bullying. He was still sitting at the kitchen table when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his brother Tony's name. "Hey, Marcus. How's retirement treating you?" "Like being pecked to death by an overprivileged duck," Marcus replied. Tony laughed. "Karen. Again." "Karen always." Marcus explained the morning's confrontation, the impossible demand, the casual threat. "You know what you need to do," Tony said when Marcus finished. "Fight fire with fire." Meaning Karen Sterling has gotten used to people rolling over for her. Maybe it's time someone showed her what real consequences look like. After ending the call, Marcus sat in silence for a long time, thinking. He was 62 years old. Recently retired from 30 years as a civil engineer. He'd spent his career solving problems, finding creative solutions to impossible challenges. Karen Sterling thought she was dealing with the same passive neighbor who'd moved his garden and taken down his wind chimes. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Marcus walked to his study and pulled out a thick folder he hadn't touched in months, his complete property survey, including detailed records of every improvement he'd made, every permit he'd obtained, every regulation he'd followed. As a civil engineer, he'd been meticulous about documentation. Every tree planted, every stone laid, every square foot of his quarter-acre paradise was legally, perfectly, unassailably his. But more than that, he knew things about property development that Karen didn't. He understood drainage patterns, soil composition, the delicate balance of grading and erosion control that kept suburban development stable. He knew which shortcuts builders took, which regulations were often ignored, which problems were quietly overlooked during construction. And he was beginning to remember some very interesting details about the construction of Karen's McMansion. Marcus spent the rest of the morning going through his files, cross-referencing dates and permits, making notes on a legal pad. By lunch time, he had the beginnings of a plan, not just to save his bamboo, but to teach Karen Sterling that some neighbors were more dangerous to threaten than others. His phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number with a local area code. "Is this Marcus Chen?" The voice was professional, female, unfamiliar. "Yes." This is Janet Morrison from Morrison and Associates. I'm calling about your property. We represent a client who's interested in making an offer. Marcus frowned. My property isn't for sale. I understand that, sir. But my client is prepared to make a very generous offer. Well. The sound of diesel engines firing to life at 7 a.m. sharp cut through the suburban morning like a chainsaw through silk. Marcus had been awake since 5:30, drinking coffee and watching from his kitchen window as Tom Hendricks positioned 3 pieces of heavy machinery along his driveway, a massive excavator, a compact bulldozer, and a dump truck that looked like it could haul half a mountain. Jesus Christ, Marcus. Karen's voice carried clearly across the fence line as she stormed out of her house in a silk robe and designer slippers. What the hell is all this noise? Marcus stepped out onto his back deck, coffee mug in hand, wearing his most innocent expression. Good morning, Karen. Just having some landscaping done. You know how it is, property improvement and all that. At 7 in the morning? On a Wednesday? Some of us are trying to sleep. Actually, city ordinances allow construction noise starting at 7 a.m. on weekdays, Marcus replied pleasantly. I checked. I'm always very careful about following the rules. Karen's face flushed red. You can't just. What are you even doing? Well, since you mentioned how much your children enjoy mountain views, I decided to redesign my backyard to maximize sightlines. Marcus gestured toward the excavator, which had just taken its first massive bite out of the lawn near his back fence. I'm putting in a pool. A pool? Karen's voice cracked slightly. You never said anything about a pool. I don't recall needing your permission to improve my own property, Marcus said, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. But don't worry, it's going to be beautiful. Tom here has some wonderful ideas about depth and positioning. Tom Hendricks, a bear of a man in his 50s who'd been excavating pools and foundations for 30 years, looked up from the excavator's controls with a grin that was pure mischief. He'd known Marcus for decades, had done the original grading when Marcus and Sarah first moved in. When Marcus had called yesterday and explained the situation, Tom had been more than happy to help teach an entitled neighbor some manners. Morning, Mrs. Sterling, Tom called out cheerfully. Beautiful day for digging, don't you think? Karen ignored him, focusing her fury on Marcus. How big is this pool supposed to be? Marcus pulled out a folded paper from his pocket, the official permit he'd obtained from the city planning office the previous afternoon. After 30 years in civil engineering, he knew exactly which strings to pull to fast-track a permit. According to the city approval, it'll be 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 12 feet deep at the deepest point. Olympic-sized, you might say. 40 feet. Karen's voice went up an octave. That's enormous. That's going to block. She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was about to say. Block what, Karen? Marcus asked innocently. Your view of my backyard. Well, I suppose that's true. But privacy is so important, don't you think? The excavator's engine roared as Tom began carving out a massive rectangle that would, when finished, sit directly between Karen's house and the distant mountains she claimed her children needed to see. Every scoop of earth brought the reality of Marcus's plan into sharper focus. This is ridiculous. Karen sputtered. Nobody needs a pool that big. This is just spite. Spite? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. Karen, this is a perfectly legal home improvement project. I have all the permits, I'm following all the regulations, and I'm staying completely within my property lines. In fact, I made sure to position it so that it meets all setback requirements while maximizing the available space. What Marcus didn't mention was that he'd positioned it to create the maximum possible visual obstruction between Karen's house and anything resembling a mountain view. The pool would sit like a massive rectangular lake, complete with safety fencing and landscaping. That would effectively wall off Karen's backyard from the rest of the world. Brad! Karen screamed toward her house. Brad! Get out here! A moment later, Brad Sterling emerged, looking like a man who'd been dragged from his morning routine against his will. At 45, Brad had the soft, pale appearance of someone who spent most of his life in climate-controlled offices. His thinning hair was uncombed, and he was still in pajama pants and a robe. What's all the noise? He asked weakly. Marcus is building a pool. A giant pool. right behind our house. Brad looked at the excavation work, then at Marcus, then back at the growing hole in the ground. Okay, he said slowly. So, it's going to block our view. What view? Brad asked, genuinely confused. View of what? Karen's face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. The mountains, Brad. The children's view of the mountains. Brad squinted toward the horizon, apparently trying to locate the mountains his wife was referring to. Oh, he said finally. Those mountains. The ones you can barely see on a clear day. Yes, those mountains. Well, Brad said reasonably, it's his property. He can build whatever he wants. Marcus had to give Brad credit. The man had finally found his spine, even if it had taken 3 years and an excavation project to locate it. Karen turned back to Marcus, her voice dropping to the dangerous whisper she used for serious threats. You think you're clever, don't you? You think this little stunt is going to teach me a lesson? I think I'm a homeowner making improvements to my property, Marcus replied calmly. Nothing more, nothing less. We'll see about that. Karen's smile was cold as winter steel. We'll just see about that. She stalked back toward her house, dragging Brad behind her. Marcus could hear her voice rising as she started making phone calls, first to the city planning office, then to the homeowners association, then to what sounded like a lawyer. Tom shut off the excavator and climbed down. That woman's going to be trouble, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. She's been trouble for 3 years, Marcus replied. The difference is, now I'm ready for her. You sure about this plan of yours? This pull's going to cost you a pretty penny. Marcus looked at the growing hole, thinking about Sarah, about the bamboo grove, about 3 years of escalating demands and threats. Tom, I've been saving for retirement for 30 years. I think I can afford to teach one entitled neighbor some manners. By lunchtime, the excavation was well underway. The hole was already 8 feet deep and growing, with neat piles of earth stacked around the perimeter. Marcus had arranged for the dirt to be hauled away rather than spread around his yard. He wanted the project to look as professional and permanent as possible. His phone had been ringing all morning. First, it was a call from the city planning office, clearly prompted by Karen's complaints. Marcus had calmly provided his permit numbers and contractor information, and the city inspector had grudgingly admitted that everything was in order. Then came the call from the HOA president, a nervous man named Peterson who clearly didn't want to be making the call. Marcus, I'm sorry to bother you, but we've received a complaint about construction noise. The work is happening during approved hours, Peterson. I have all the permits, and I'm following all the noise ordinances. Yes, well, Mrs. Sterling seems to think the pool is unnecessarily large. Peterson, does the HOA have regulations about pool size? A pause. Well, no, not specifically. Then I don't see what the problem is. By afternoon, Karen had escalated to what Marcus recognized as a nuclear option. She called his daughter. Emily Chen Rodriguez lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 young children. She was a successful architect who had inherited her father's methodical nature and her mother's fierce loyalty to family. When her phone rang and she saw her father's neighbor's name on the caller ID, she knew immediately that something was wrong. Mrs. Sterling? Is everything all right? Is my father okay? Oh, Emily, I'm so glad you answered. Karen's voice dripped with false concern. I'm worried about your father. He's been acting very strangely lately. Very aggressive. Emily's blood pressure spiked. After her mother's death, she'd worried constantly about her father's mental health, his isolation, his ability to cope with living alone. What do you mean, aggressive? Well, he's building this enormous pool, right behind our house. It's completely unnecessary, and I think it might be some kind of episode. You know how grief can affect people, especially older men living alone. The suggestion hit exactly the nerve Karen had intended. Emily had spent 5 years worrying about her father, checking on him regularly, watching for signs of depression or cognitive decline. The idea that he might be having some kind of breakdown. And she wasn't there to help. Mrs. Sterling, has my father been taking care of himself? Eating properly? Is the house clean? Oh, I wouldn't know about that, Karen said smoothly. We are not that close. But this pool project, it's just so out of character for him. So hostile. I'm concerned that he might need some kind of intervention. 20 minutes later, Emily was on the phone with her father. Dad, Mrs. Sterling, called me. She's worried about you. Marcus was standing in his backyard, watching Tom maneuver the excavator around a particularly stubborn root system. Is she now? How thoughtful of her. Dad, she said you're building some kind of giant pool. That you're being aggressive with the neighbors. That's not like you. Emily, I'm building a perfectly legal, properly permitted swimming pool on my own property. There's nothing aggressive about home improvement. But Dad, a pool? You haven't mentioned wanting a pool. You've never been much of a swimmer. Marcus arrived at the designated meeting spot, a small park 3 blocks from their neighborhood, carrying a manila folder and wearing the kind of calm expression that had served him well during 30 years of contentious construction meetings. Karen was already there, sitting on a bench beside a man Marcus didn't recognize. The stranger was tall, expensively dressed, with a kind of predatory smile that made Marcus immediately think of loan sharks and insurance adjusters. Marcus, Karen said, rising from the bench. Thank you for coming. This is Richard Blackwood. He's a consultant. Blackwood extended a manicured hand. Mr. Chen, I've heard quite a lot about you. Marcus didn't shake the offered hand. What kind of consultant? The kind who solves problems, Blackwood replied smoothly. And from what? Mrs. Sterling tells me you've become quite a problem. Have I? Karen stepped closer, her voice taking on the honeyed tone she used when she was about to make someone an offer they couldn't refuse. Marcus, we are all reasonable adults here. This situation has gotten out of hand, and I think it's time we found a mutually beneficial solution. Marcus remained silent, waiting. The truth is, Karen continued, Brad and I have been thinking about expanding our property. We'd like to buy your house. I told your real estate agent yesterday, my house isn't for sale. That was my agent, Blackwood interjected. And Mrs. Sterling is prepared to make a very generous offer, significantly above market value. Marcus opened his manila folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. Let me guess. 20% above market value? Maybe 25. Karen's eyes lit up. Actually, we were thinking 30% above, $2 million. The number hung in the morning air like a gunshot. Karen's mouth fell open. Blackwood's predatory smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself. I'm sorry. Karen said weakly. $2 million, Marcus repeated calmly. Cash. That's what it would cost you to buy my house. That's ridiculous. Karen sputtered. Your house isn't worth anywhere near $2 million. You're absolutely right, Marcus agreed. My house is worth about $400,000. But my willingness to sell it to you? That's worth $2 million. Supply and demand, Karen. Basic economics. Blackwood leaned forward slightly. Mr. Chen, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of this negotiation. Mrs. Sterling is trying to help you avoid some very unpleasant complications. What kind of complications? Well, for instance, that pool you're building. Large excavation projects can be very dangerous. Accidents happen. Permits get revoked. City inspectors find violations they might have missed initially. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood? I'm simply pointing out that construction projects face many potential obstacles. It would be unfortunate if your expensive pool project encountered any setbacks. Especially, Karen added, her confidence returning, given your recent emotional state. Emily is such a lovely girl, by the way. She's very worried about you. In fact, she mentioned she might need to come visit soon. Make sure you're taking care of yourself properly. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus had seen enough. Small-town politics to recognize the pattern. Pressure on multiple fronts, family members drawn into the conflict, official channels manipulated to create problems. Karen wasn't just trying to buy his house. She was orchestrating a campaign designed to make his life unbearable until he surrendered. Interesting strategy, Marcus said thoughtfully. Threaten the construction project, manipulate my daughter, apply pressure through official channels. Very thorough. It's not a strategy, Karen said defensively. It's just concern. Neighborly concern. Marcus closed his manila folder and stood up. In that case, let me ease your concerns. My pool project is going to proceed exactly as planned. The permits are in order, the construction is being done by licensed professionals, and every aspect of the work meets or exceeds city codes. Mr. Chen, Blackwood said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, I don't think you understand how serious Mrs. Sterling is about this. She has connections throughout the city government, friends in the planning department, relationships with people who can make your life very difficult. Does she now? Marcus smiled for the first time since the conversation began. That's fascinating, because I have some connections of my own. He opened his folder again and pulled out a thick stack of photographs. These were taken during the construction of the Sterling house 3 years ago. Interesting foundation work, don't you think? Karen went pale. Blackwood leaned in to look at the photographs, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to something approaching concern. These show some very creative interpretations of city building codes, Marcus continued conversationally, particularly the drainage requirements, and the setback measurements, and the soil compaction standards. Those photos don't prove anything, Karen said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe not individually, Marcus agreed, but taken together, along with these soil analysis reports, and these drainage calculations, and these structural engineering assessments. He pulled out more documents. Well, they paint a very interesting picture of what happens when someone tries to cut corners on a major construction project. Blackwood was studying the photographs intently. Where did you get these? I'm a civil engineer, Mr. Blackwood. I've worked on dozens of construction projects in this city over the past 30 years. When a new house goes up in my neighborhood, I tend to pay attention, especially when that house is being built by a contractor known for creative interpretations of building codes. Marcus had spent the previous evening going through files he'd maintained for years, part professional curiosity, part engineer's obsession with proper construction practices. When Karen's McMansion had gone up, he'd noticed several questionable decisions, but at the time it hadn't been his business to interfere. Now it was. The foundation pour on the west side is 6 inches short of code requirements, Marcus continued matter-of-factly. The drainage system diverts water directly onto city property, which violates municipal ordinances. And the soil compaction tests that were submitted to the city? They don't match the actual soil conditions. In fact, I'd say there's about a 30% chance that house will have significant structural problems within the next 5 years. Karen found her voice. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. You see, Karen, you made one crucial mistake when you decided to threaten me. You assumed I was just some sad old widower who could be pushed around. What you didn't consider was that I spent 30 years building things that had to pass rigorous inspections, meet exact specifications, and last for decades. Marcus put the photographs back in his folder. I know which shortcuts builders take when they think no one's watching. I know which inspectors can be bought, which permits can be rushed through, which problems can be hidden under landscaping and fresh paint. And I know exactly what happens when someone with the right expertise decides to take a very close look at a questionable construction project. Blackwood was no longer smiling. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Chen? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply sharing some observations about construction practices in our neighborhood. Of course, if someone were to file official complaints with the city building department, request new inspections, demand soil stability assessments, well, that could be very expensive and time-consuming for the homeowners involved. This is blackmail, Karen whispered. Is it? I thought it was neighborly concern. Marcus stood up, tucking his folder under his arm. Just like your concern about my pool project. He turned to walk away, then paused. Oh, and Karen? About those connections you mentioned in city government? I worked with most of those people. For 3 decades. I was the guy they called when projects went wrong, when buildings failed inspections, when someone needed to figure out how to fix expensive mistakes. Marcus smiled pleasantly. So when you make those phone calls about my pool project, make sure to mention my name. I think you'll find they remember me quite fondly. He walked away, leaving Karen and Blackwood sitting in stunned silence on the park bench. By the time Marcus got home, Tom's crew was already back at work, installing the steel reinforcement framework that would support the pool's concrete shell. The project was moving ahead exactly on schedule, and Marcus could see Karen's house clearly from the excavation site. Every window facing his yard would soon have an unobstructed view of his pool fence and nothing else. His phone rang as he was watching the crew work. Emily's name appeared on the caller ID. "Dad, I had the strangest conversation with Mrs. Sterling yesterday." "Did you?" "She called back after we talked. Said she was even more worried about you, that you seemed paranoid and possibly delusional. She suggested I might need to consider some kind of intervention." Marcus sighed. Karen was escalating exactly as he'd expected, trying to convince his daughter that he was mentally unstable. Do I sound paranoid and delusional to you?" "Actually, no. You sound more like yourself than you have in months. More focused." Emily paused. "Dad, what's really going on over there?" Marcus looked at the pool construction, at the bamboo grove Sarah had loved, at the house where he and his wife had built a life together. "I'm drawing so." The first sign that something was wrong came at 3:17 a.m. when Marcus woke to the sound of his motion sensor lights flooding the backyard with white light. He'd been a light sleeper since Sarah's death, attuned to every sound in the house that had once been filled with 2 lives instead of 1. Through his bedroom window, he could see a figure moving near the pool excavation. Marcus slipped on his robe and grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand. By the time he reached the back door, the figure was gone, but the damage was already visible. Someone had poured concrete mix into the steel reinforcement framework, not enough to ruin the project, but enough to create expensive delays and complications. "Petty vandalism," Marcus murmured to himself, taking photos with his phone. "Very petty." But as he examined the scene more carefully, he realized the vandalism was almost deliberately half-hearted. The concrete could be removed, the framework cleaned, the project resumed within a day or 2. It was harassment, not sabotage, the kind of escalation meant to annoy rather than destroy. Which meant Karen was still underestimating him. Marcus made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, thinking. In 30 years of construction work, he'd dealt with every kind of pressure tactic, from union disputes to permit delays to clients who thought intimidation was a negotiation strategy. The key was always the same: understand what your opponent really wanted, then control the battlefield. Karen claimed she wanted the bamboo cut down for her children's view. But children didn't care about distant mountain views they could barely see. This was about something else entirely. His phone rang at 6:30 a.m. Tom Hendricks, calling early as promised. "Marcus, I'm on my way over, but we've got a problem. City inspector called this morning. Anonymous complaint about our permit. Says we need to shut down until they can do a full site review." "When?" "This morning. Soon as he can get out there." Marcus smiled grimly. Karen was playing exactly the game he'd expected. "Tom, do me a favor. When the inspector gets here, make sure he sees the vandalism from last night. Get it documented in his report." "What vandalism?" "The concrete someone poured into our framework. Very amateur work. Very desperate." 20 minutes later, the city inspector arrived, a thin, nervous man named Williams whom Marcus remembered from several projects over the years. Williams had always been competent but easily flustered, the kind of bureaucrat who followed rules precisely because he was terrified of making mistakes. "Marcus," Williams said, climbing out of his city truck. "Been a while. Heard you retired. Just last year. This pool is kind of a retirement gift to myself." Williams looked uncomfortable. "Yeah, about that. Got a complaint yesterday. Someone saying the excavation might not meet setback requirements. I've got to do a full measurement." "Of course. But while you're here, I need you to document some vandalism that happened last night." Marcus led Williams to the concrete-fouled framework. Someone tried to sabotage the construction. Williams pulled out his measuring tape and camera, methodically documenting both the vandalism and the excavation dimensions. Marcus watched patiently, knowing exactly what the measurements would show. He triple-checked every specification before breaking ground. "Well," Williams said finally, "excavation meets all setback requirements. Actually, you've got about 2 feet more clearance than the minimum." And this vandalism? He shook his head. This is criminal mischief. You should file a police report. I intend to, Marcus replied. Any idea who might have filed the complaint? Williams looked even more uncomfortable. Anonymous complaints don't require names. But he lowered his voice. Between you and me, Marcus, this has the feel of a neighbor dispute. You having problems with anyone? Before Marcus could answer, Karen's voice cut across the morning air. Mr. Williams. Thank goodness you're here. She was striding across her yard toward the fence, wearing a designer jogging outfit and expression of righteous concern. Behind her, Marcus could see Brad hanging back near their house, clearly reluctant to be part of whatever was about to happen. Mrs. Sterling, Williams said wearily. Good morning. Is it? Is it really? Karen's voice took on the dramatic tone she used for homeowners association meetings. Mr. Williams, I'm very concerned about this construction project. The noise, the disruption, the potential safety hazards. I've just completed a full inspection. The project meets all city requirements. But surely the size of this pool is excessive. It's practically a public swimming facility. Williams consulted his clipboard. The city doesn't regulate pool size beyond basic safety requirements. This pool meets all applicable codes. Karen's facade of concern began to crack. What about the environmental impact? The drainage issues? The effect on property values? Those aren't building code issues. If you have concerns about drainage, you'll need to contact the Environmental Services Department. Marcus watched Karen's growing frustration with professional interest. She'd clearly expected the city inspector to find problems to shut down his project, to give her the official victory she needed. Instead, she was getting a patient bureaucrat who followed rules rather than personalities. This is ridiculous. Karen finally exploded. He's building this pool just to spite me. Just to block my family's view. It's harassment. Williams looked from Karen to Marcus, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Homeowners have the right to make improvements to their property as long as they follow applicable codes. Personal disputes between neighbors aren't a city matter. Personal disputes. Karen's voice went dangerously quiet. Mr. Williams, what if I told you that Mr. Chen has been systematically harassing my family? Making threats. Engaging in what can only be described as stalking behavior. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was escalation beyond anything he'd anticipated. If you believe a crime has been committed, you need to contact the police department, not the building inspector. Oh, I intend to. Karen's smile was razor-sharp. I intend to do exactly that. After Williams left, Marcus stood in his backyard, thinking furiously. Karen's threat to involve the police was serious, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because false accusations could still cause significant problems. A harassment complaint, even an unfounded one, would create exactly the kind of official record that could complicate his life for months or years. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in several years. Rodriguez Investigations. This is Maria. Maria, it's Marcus Chen. I need a favor. Maria Rodriguez was a former police detective who'd gone private after 20 years on the force. She and her husband had been friends with Marcus and Sarah, part of the couple's dinner parties and neighborhood barbecues that had made life rich and meaningful before cancer stole Sarah away. Marcus. How are you holding up? I've been better. Maria, I need a background check. Full workup. Someone who's been making my life difficult. Neighbor problems. Neighbor problems with escalation potential. She's threatening to file harassment complaints, and I need to know what I'm dealing with before she makes her move. Marcus gave Maria the basic information about Karen and Brad Sterling, along with what he knew about Richard Blackwood. Maria promised to have preliminary information within 24 hours. That afternoon, Marcus made another call, this one to his insurance agent, updating his homeowner's policy and specifically asking about coverage for false accusations and legal defense costs. 30 years in construction had taught him that the best time to prepare for a lawsuit was before anyone started talking about lawyers. By evening, the concrete vandalism had been cleaned up and the pool construction was back on schedule. Tom's crew worked until dark, installing plumbing and electrical systems with the methodical efficiency of professionals who'd done this work thousands of times. Marcus was cleaning up after dinner when his doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he could see 2 police officers on his front porch. "Mr. Chen. I'm Officer Davidson, this is Officer Martinez. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Marcus invited. The men, offering coffee, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him well through 3 decades of difficult conversations. "Sir," Officer Davidson began, consulting his notebook, "we've received a complaint from your neighbor, Karen Sterling. She alleges that you've been engaging in harassing behavior, making threats, and possibly stalking her family." "I see. What specific behavior is she alleging?" "Well, she says you've been taking photographs of her house and family. That you've made threatening statements about making her life difficult. And that you're building this pool specifically to harass her." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Officer, may I show you something?" He led them to his study, where he pulled out the thick folder of documentation he'd been maintaining. "These are photographs and records related to a construction project in my neighborhood. I'm a civil engineer, was a civil engineer, and I maintain professional documentation of construction practices that might affect drainage, soil stability, or safety in my immediate area." Officer Martinez looked through the photographs. "These are pretty detailed. Professional quality. I use professional equipment for professional documentation. Officer, Mrs. Sterling has been pressuring me for several months to remove landscaping from my property. When I refused, she began